lecture, which celebrates Greenbaum's contribution to the Center for Philosophy of Science and to PIT. Her talk is entitled Fundamentality of Physics Without Completeness. The talk is at 3:30 on the 10th floor and will be followed by a reception here at the center. On Tuesday next week, we have our next lunchtime talk given by Karl Hofer, our senior visiting fellow here, who will be talking about natural kinds, laws, and necessities, lessons from post-twin Earth science in philosophy. And on Friday next week, Frédéric Yaek here, who is a fellow at the center this semester, will be talking about what is called thinking in mathematics. We are looking forward to all these talks at the center in the coming days. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Chris Pincock, who many of you know, so it's in many ways not a very useful introduction, but I will do it nonetheless. It's part of the FFF, which is Future Former Fellow Series, where we're bringing back people who have been at the center as fellows. So it's actually wonderful that Chris was able to make the drive instead of joining us online. In fact, I think we're actually delighted you were able to do that. Chris is professor at OSU, so not that far from here. He works in general philosophy of science, philosophy and philosophy of mathematics. He also has interest in the history of analytic philosophy. He has published widely on all of these topics in all the best journals. I want to put a very long list of publications, but I will mention his two books. The one published in 2012 with OUP, whose title is Mathematics and Scientific Representation, which is a widely known book. And more recently, he has published a shorter book in the Element Series of Cambridge entitled Mathematics and Explanation, which I highly recommend. I don't think it's fully accessible anymore now, right? It used to be, but
I can send you a free PDF.
All right.
Email.
That's right. We didn't hear that. It was not recorded, sir. In any case, today Chris will be talking about explaining the success of model. Please, floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for coming. It is a nice opportunity to return to the center. Back in 2008, here is John giving me the ceremonial umbrella that at least at that time was given at the fellows talks. And I have very, very fond memories. I think obviously this center is one of the most important places for the philosophy of science in the world. And it's really just a wonderful thing that it's continuing and flourishing in all the ways that it has. And I would like to thank John for his leadership at that time. Amongst other things, I think it was only because of the conditions that John created that I was able to actually finish the book that Edward mentioned, Mathematics and Scientific Representation. So there's a very long abstract on the website. This is what I could jam onto this slide. The basic plan is to take something like the traditional inference, the best explanation defense of scientific realism, which is applied to theories, and adapt it to successful models. The special problem that models create is that they are idealized in various respects. And so what sorts of claims should we extract from the models, given that they're idealized? And then how could successful models support the theoretical claims that went into the specification of those models? So it's a very general problem. Some people think that there are no such circumstances. And so I'm going to try to sketch out a positive account of how that works. It involves inference to the best explanation. So for me, there will be these two steps. And well, just make it clear from the beginning that not in every case should we take the success of a model to license a causal generalization. And even if we've got that first step down, not in every case should we go back and endorse the theoretical claims that went into it. But under the conditions that I'll try to describe, namely where the best explanation turns out to be like this, we should go forward. And so I guess a preliminary conclusion then would be if you're willing to accept inference the best explanation, which many people are not, but if you are, then you have a way to respond to this idealized models problem. Then the bigger picture question is, but is it necessary? Is this the only way to address this issue? And that's a much more difficult thing to discuss, but I will try to discuss that in section 4. So for me, Psilos is the clearest, the most well worked out attempt to defend an appropriately limited form of scientific realism. But in the course of doing so, he says something that, when it's taken out of context, can create this problem with idealization that we'll talk about. So he is interested in how to limit the commitments. Which parts of a successful scientific theory should we really endorse? And he says, well, the ones that can best explain empirical successes are precisely those which are essentially and ineliminably involved in the generation of the predictions and the design of the methodology which brought those predictions about. So Newton's assumptions about gravity, yes, they were playing a role in his successes. Newton's assumptions about absolute space were not playing a role. And so we can parse the theory, even though the theories committed all these things, we can selectively endorse only those things that actually were essentially and ineliminably involved. Okay, but now when we turn to the practice of science, and right around the time of Psilos's book, many people were emphasizing the significance of model-based science. What's going on in model-based science? We have a certain model that sort of stands in between the theory and the target system. And if you're trying to make sense of how this successful prediction came about, you have to bring in the model. But when you look at how the model is specified, you find not only some theoretical claims like Newton's law of universal gravitation, but you find some additional assumptions that are kind of tailoring the model to the system that you're investigating, or making other sorts of simplifications necessary to actually use the model or get the model to work. And many of these assumptions turn out to be false, right? If you take those claims to be claims about the target you're investigating, you believe that they're false. This is the notion of idealization that I'm working with. So an idealization is a claim that you're using in your scientific investigations into some target, but you actually think is false of that target. Right? And so there's a puzzle about, one puzzle is, how could that ever work? But the deeper puzzle is, given that those claims seem to be equally essentially involved in the success of the model, how can you take the success to support the theory rather than the idealizations as well? Okay. So both the theoretical claims, which by assumption you don't know, they may or may not be true, and these idealizations, which you at least believe to be false, they're both, quote, essentially and ineliminably involved in the generation of these accurate predictions. So they both seem to satisfy the limited realist tests. So how then could you use inference to the best explanation or any other principled form of inference to conclude that the theoretical claims are true? Right? It seems to be a sort of hypocritical attitude. The things that I want to be true, well, they're supported. Things that I believe to be false, well, they don't get any support. There's different ways to put it. If some false claims contribute to the accurate prediction, then the theoretical claims could make that very same sort of contribution and yet be false. And there's a nice edited volume by Satsi, Rutledge Handbook of Scientific Realism or something like that. And there's 3 separate chapters where people raise these concerns, including a nice chapter by Arnon. The Satsi one hurt me the most, okay, because Satsi, he's always been there on the realist side, and you read a lot of things by Satsi, and he's sort of he's like losing faith. And one of the reasons is this idealization problem. A lot of other people are, I don't know if they're exactly, I think in Massimi's case, it's pretty explicit that issues about modeling support for what I'm calling anti-realism. Other people, I think you can also see it see it in their writings. And these are top-notch philosophers writing books advocating for alternatives to scientific realism. Elgin, how does she put it? Well, when we look at successful science, we find a mix of truth and falsity. And so what we should really aim for is not scientific knowledge, which requires truth, but scientific understanding. Okay, so she wants to change the goal to a scientific understanding, which is a non-factive state for her. Massimi, maybe it's an uncharitable way to put it, but she wants to maintain scientific knowledge, but recognizes this issue and solves it by making scientific knowledge fundamentally perspectival, which is that you do not know anything outright, but you only know something with respect to some perspective or with respect to a range of perspectives. To me, this is not the knowledge that we signed up for at scientific realism. This is something else. And so I think I also wish to avoid this outcome. Chang, he's not redefining knowledge, he's redefining truth. Okay. Same point. All right. Let's try to map out this broadly scientific realist argument that takes account of the central role of idealizations. I mean, one idea would be, no, I'm just going to get by without models, or I'm going to get by with models that can be somehow de-idealized. This is not the strategy that I'm looking at today. So take a theoretical claim, and you imagine it's used to specify a series of models, and each model is directed at its own phenomenon. Who could you think of in this context? Well, just think about Newton. Okay, he used his universal law of gravitation to specify all these different models, including this model that's represented there in the corner, his model of the tides. That's just one of the models. Everybody who likes IBE also likes Darwin, because Darwin says some explanatory things at certain points. His core theoretical claim is that evolutionary change occurs by natural selection, or a large amount of evolutionary change occurs by natural selection. So not everything, but and if you want to find a model in Darwin, you can look at the one diagram, that tree diagram, and this is where he is illustrating a divergence of character. Okay, so it's perhaps maybe a somewhat forced comparison to think of that's a model like Newton's model of the tides, but if you think about models in a certain way, there's no issue there. Now I will be talking about models in a certain, perhaps unusual way, but I don't know how controversial this terminology would be, but what I'm interested in and what I'll be assuming is that there are certain things that are inputs to the model. They are propositions. They are claims that you deploy in specifying and interpreting the model. What mathematical structure are you talking about? What do these elements of this mathematical structure stand for? What sort of correspondence do you think exists between the model and its intended target? As a result of that, which I think you could fill it out in different ways, maybe for concrete models, mathematical models, but however you do it, whatever sort of model you're talking about, I'm going to say that model is going to generate a bunch of output claims that are about the target. And many of them you recognize to be false, many of them you take to be true, and then some will be otherwise unknown. So obviously, or I guess not surprisingly, if the model is specified using idealizations, that is, things that the model user believes to be false of the target, you would also expect many of these outputted, generated propositions to be false. So one example in Newton's case, was clearly recognized by him and everybody else, is that his model put the high tide right under the moon, right? So as the moon was going around, that's where the high tide was. Whereas, in fact, they recognized that the actual tides, there was a certain lag, there was a certain time gap. So the response by the water to the moon was not immediate. So that's a divergence between the model and the target that Newton recognized, but it was not inconsistent with him drawing other conclusions from the model. Darwin, you can read that whole discussion of divergence, and it's presented, and the diagram suggests that it's going to proceed in a very constant and linear way, that these changes just accumulate in sort of a regular time over, it says like 1,000 generations or 100,000 generations. Right? So you could say in the model, or according to the model, the rate is constant. But Darwin says explicitly, but I don't suppose that the process ever goes on so regularly as is represented in the diagram. So that's like a implication of the idealizations that are put in there when he's specifying the model, but it's not fatal to the model. So yeah, this is the diagram. There's some modern recreation of the grass, plot of grass, and it's sort of overrun by all the different species of grass, and that's supposed to illustrate divergence. Okay. So what we're interested in the first step is the extent to which, when an idealized model generates some predictions and you check them and they're accurate, you want to conclude that something else that the model generates, namely a causal generalization, is also accurate or also genuine. And this is a kind of extrapolation, right? This is a kind of ampliative reasoning. The fact that your model got these predictions right doesn't guarantee that it's getting some causal generalization right. For all and we know it's getting some things wrong, right? So why should it be getting this stuff right over here? Now, here are the controversial claims that I come back to in section 4. First, I mean, there's different ways to think about it, but for me, if you're a scientific realist, you need to articulate your defense of scientific realism. You need to say why you're a scientific realist. And when somebody challenges you in these idealized models, say, yeah, I see what you're talking about, but here's my response. That kind of articulation to me requires some sort of formulation of some kind of ampliative inference, right, where the conclusion goes beyond the premises. To me, that's some kind of internalist epistemic attitude that if somebody challenges you, you have to be able to articulate and respond. And you can't just say what some classical externalists say, which is, well, if my beliefs were formed by a reliable process, I know. And that, like, that's the end of the debate. Okay. So, but this is controversial, and whether this is really a well-motivated requirement, I'm happy, very much happy to discuss later. Even more, I don't know, out there would be to suggest that inference, the best explanation, is the only way that this could be done. This, I think, is further controversy. I want to illustrate at least the sufficient point that if you assume inference the best explanation, you get a way out of these puzzles, and then come back to whether it's the only way in section 2. Okay, what is inference the best explanation? There's a lot of debate about it. There's a lot of skepticism about it. Here's the basic schema for how I'm thinking about it. You assemble your evidence in this one massive premise, which invokes the existence of a bunch of phenomena and the potential explanations that you're able to generate of those phenomena. And of these, E1 is the best. And in virtue of being the best, you conclude E1. You conclude that E1 is true. Now, what are the phenomena in this case? What we're interested in is what's the significance of this model's success? So for me, this is a phenomenon that involves the models themselves. This model is regularly capable of generating accurate predictions. So we've already, if you want to be really Identical, you could say, well, you don't know that. You don't know that the model is regularly capable of generating accurate predictions. You just know that it's generated these predictions that it turned out to be accurate. So there's already a sort of move from some raw data to some phenomena that data supports, which I think should be relatively uncontroversial. Still, it's going a little bit beyond what you've sort of strictly speaking found. But that's a phenomena that we want to explain, just like we want to explain any ordinary scientific phenomenon. And for the purposes of doing that, we're going to generate a bunch of different potential explanations and figure out which of these is the best. What are some options? Well, you could posit the least extensive kind of correspondence between the model and the target. Right? You could say the only true claims generated by the model are the ones that have been checked. These are two bad ones. Starting one. These are not going to be the best. The other one, kind of equally reflexive, all the claims generated by the model are true. No, it's not so good. Why not the least extensive one? Well, it makes the success of the model highly coincidental. You haven't identified anything in virtue of which these ones that were chosen turned out to be correct. It was high. You're very lucky because, or very unlucky, depending on how you think about it. Only the things that you've checked are the ones. The only truths generated by the model are the ones that you've checked. Why is that? It just matches up exactly in that. No, that's not much of an explanation. The most extensive correspondence explanation is not very good for a different reason. And this gets into the issue of how you can treat the idealizations differently. You're not going to take seriously an explanation that posits that something that you believe going in actually turns out to be false, except in really exceptional circumstances. So, I mean, in the case of Newton's model, it was that the idealization is that the water responds immediately to the impressed tidal forces. But nobody believed that. And that like for Newton to accept that would be, a violation of all this stuff that he believes about fluids. Similarly, if you imagine Darwin, well, my model says that this thing happens regularly, even though I actually believe it doesn't, and I have all sorts of evidence that it doesn't. You just can't take that explanation seriously. It's a possibility, but you would rank it very low in terms of the currency of inference, the best explanation. So the best potential explanation will be somewhat intermediate. It has to identify something that the phenomenon depends on, right? What enables the model to get all these things right, while also fitting with our background beliefs, right? Which is a kind of explanatory virtue that sometimes people call conservativeness. What's that going to look like? Well, obviously, I want it to be something that will license a causal generalization. And for the reasons just discussed, in order to find that intermediate mix, you're going to go with the explanation that posits a correspondence that's both systematic and robust. Okay. Systematic to me here just means it gets more actual truths than the ones that you've checked. So it's extending beyond what you've actually checked according to some sort of perhaps opaque pattern. Robust, this is the counterfactual thing. The model has the capacity to get things right, not just for the actual world, right, which you think would be another sort of coincidence. Because when you built the model, you didn't really know how the actual world was in a lot of respects. The model has the capacity to generate true predictions for how things would be in a range of counterfactual circumstances. Okay. I mean, you can agree, or I hope you can agree, that if we're generating potential explanations for the predictive successes of these models, the best explanation in terms of these virtues that I've emphasized, identifying something that the result depends on, and conservativeness, that's going to posit this kind of extensive but still limited correspondence between the model and its target. If so, right, and you're IBE, friendly, then you will endorse the existence of that sort of correspondence. But that pretty much settles that the model will also generate a genuine causal generalization. I don't know how, maybe it could have been more explicit on this slide, but I'm thinking of causal generalizations in the interventionist Woodward style way. They do not require, getting a fundamental reality or identifying a process or anything like that. You have to just indicate what would happen under a certain sort of counterfactual circumstance in intervention. But some such generalization will be generated by the model whenever it stands in a systematic and robust correspondence. Now, there's certain ways to think about models, certain doubts, which I phrase here as, well, this just can't be right. An idealized model cannot stand in this kind of correspondence relation to a target. And I just, I don't agree with this worry. I mean, the kind of correspondence that I'm talking about is just that the model generates a bunch of propositions and some of them are true. I've probably in a sort of longer discussion, I would say, and how does that happen? Well, it's because there's a certain kind of structural relationship between the model structure and the target. A lot of people don't like that. Still, however it comes about, I think this sort of limited, what I'm calling systematic and robust correspondence is very possible. And here's some sort of illustration. If you have a treasure map that talks about gold bars and it also talks about diamonds, it could be that all the claims about the gold are true and all the claims about the diamonds are false. We start trying to dig up things and we find a certain pattern of success and lack of success. And so we draw the conclusion that, yeah, the model is getting the gold stuff right. That's the kind of correspondence that we're going to posit. So, I mean, I agree that in any particular case, what sort of extrapolation or what sort of causal generalization you're going to go with is very delicate scientific judgment involved there, but it seems very regularly possible. So in Newton's case, his model of the tides, what they call the equilibrium model, because it made this unrealistic assumption about the response of the water. Still, it did support a number of causal generalizations, including were the rate of rotation of the Earth to change, the times of the tides would change. That's not maybe as much as you might like from an explanation of the tides. That's the respect in which I think Salmon's point that Newton explained the tides by identifying the cause of the tides. I think that's a long story to figure out how you really explain all these different aspects of the tides. But still, Newton got some causal generalizations out of his model, and they were accurate. Darwin, I maybe struggled a little bit to identify a genuine causal generalization that comes out of Darwin's discussion, because it is very subject to criticism. But it does seem that his model would support this sort of causal claim. Diversification of structure causes greater support of life in some ecosystem. Other of the models that he develops later in the book, those would support other sorts of causal generalizations. So this is the pattern that I see in these two canonical cases. Okay. Now you could imagine. So we've gone to step 2. I mean, I think it is helpful to distinguish these two steps because, as I said before, Maybe you don't even find a success that warrants step one, but you could find a success that warrants step one. Got a bunch of models that generate these causal generalizations, but you don't want to go now with step two. You don't want to go back to theoretical claims. In particular, you might not even have a theory when you start with the modeling. So step two is a additional step that can be taken only in certain special circumstances, and it requires additional sorts of evidence, additional sorts of considerations. So even if a series of models of various phenomena each support their own causal generalizations, you might still worry that the idealizations of each model block this success from providing support to the claims that went into the model. Say Newton's law of universal gravitation, Darwin's somewhat qualified principle of natural selection here. Well, here's the strategy. We've got a new phenomenon now, different from the phenomenon we started with. The new phenomenon is, what is the connection between the fact that all these models were specified using these theoretical claims, and they showed this capacity to generate these, what we're now taking to be genuine causal generalizations? How did that happen? Why did it happen? And obviously the realist will take very seriously the potential explanation that says, yeah, well, that was because that theoretical claim was true. It's no accident. So in those circumstances where the best potential explanation is that the theoretical claim is true, the use of inference, the best explanation, will now also get us the truth of some of these theoretical claims. What other potential explanations are, on the table? Well, here perhaps I didn't really try hard enough to come up with serious competitors. And there could be a lot to say. Especially the limited scientific realist, the selective scientific realist, should be open to the possibility that the theoretical claim that was actually used is actually too strong. You kind of went overboard, say Darwin. You exaggerated something. I mean, if Darwin said, contrary to what he seemed to have believed, he said everything happened because of natural selection, that would have been overkill. And the success of his models at generating these causal generalizations wouldn't warrant that account of why he got things right. Similarly, you might have some doubts about the law of universal gravitation because you know the history of science. That's a fair point. It's a fair point. So exactly which theoretical claim you want to endorse, I think, is a subtle matter. But whatever it is, it's going to be better than these other ones that say this whole process worked out because the claim is false. That's not a very good explanation. If you said the claim is irrelevant to the success of the models, number 4, that's also not a very good explanation. But a lot of people will say, well, no, it worked not because it was true, but because it was merely empirically adequate. Empirical adequacy is enough to explain what happened in these cases. And this to me is the virtue or the payoff of taking the time to go through step 1 first. Because if you look at problems for 3, to the extent that the causal generalizations that you've now endorsed go beyond the observable, you can't, I don't see how you can very well explain the success of the model at getting those causal generalizations just by thinking that the theoretical claim is empirically adequate. So that sort of weakening, right, the constructive empiricist sort of weakening is, I think, going to undermine the explanatory goodness of number 3. Moving to the getting into the final phase. Many objections. Okay, and then considering more specific objections to those claims that I flagged earlier. First, the conditions for this elaborate double use of IBE are hardly ever met in actual science. Yes, I agree. this is a highly selective form of scientific realism. Perhaps much more selective than Psillos. That's okay for me. And it's still significant because the anti-realists, Elgin, the people I'm calling anti-realists, Elgin, Simi, and Chang, they rely on the impossibility. It's impossible. I mean, Elgin, I think, would say it's a foolish goal for science to pursue. Number two, big one, appealing to inference the best explanation begs the question in favor of realism. I mean, definitely I've assumed that inference the best explanation is capable of affording knowledge. And many anti-realists deny that. But this does not beg the question in favor of realism, because making this assumption about inference the best explanation doesn't guarantee that we have this sort of knowledge. We have to have these additional substantial conditions met. Namely, we have to have these sorts of theories and models and successes. And have to look at cases and make that case there. I mean, I take on the additional burden of providing some account of where does inference the best explanation come from, or there's nothing like that in this paper here. But I mean, I accept that sort of philosophical point. How can you assume that IB is capable of affording knowledge and not say anything else about it? Okay. But the worries that I focused on here are the idealized models work, and they are not explicitly directed at inference the best explanation. They're pointing out this feature of model-based science. Yeah, we can certainly talk about more of that. This IB-inspired account of scientific knowledge is too detached from scientific practice. Three different kinds of responses. Well, not always. Okay. Remember the heroes, Newton, Darwin, and then if you're opposed to IBE, you'll think that like scientists kind of got swept up in it, and then you find all the scientists putting their arguments in terms of explanatory consideration. Well, they should never have done that. Okay, but in fact, part of the practice for me is that some scientists say these things. So that's one consideration. But another consideration would be, no, you're right. A lot of the time, scientists aren't actually claiming to know anything. They're engaged in this more exploratory work. And so scientific realists should say, yeah, they don't have to put things in explanatory terms, and we shouldn't either. We should allow a sort of open-ended exploration of these possibilities. So maybe certainly traditional scientific realists went way too far in their realist commitments, and maybe even someone like Psillos ignored this exploratory project as well. C, maybe this is where I think I could do something, maybe. Even if the scientists aren't really doing it, we can do it. We can reconstruct these arguments in these terms. And that's at least effective against other philosophers who say this sort of knowledge is impossible. Humans could just never have this sort of knowledge. Here, it could work like this. That's maybe a fairly weak point, but I still think important for philosophers. All right. More briefly now, returning to the necessity. So there's the idealized models problem. Tried to illustrate how, if we take for granted that inference the best explanation can generate scientific knowledge in this two-step way that I described, here's how it would work. But do we really need some form of amplitude inference? That would be the first claim. And even if we do, is inference the best explanation the only way to go? Well, if this first claim has to do with some sort of internalism, then externalism of some kind, that no form of amplitude inference is needed. Something like reliabilism or something like that. Talk about that briefly. What other inferences could you think about? Well, you could think about other sort of generic forms of inference, like normative induction, okay, or some sort of particularist form of, so not form, particularist material inferences. And this is obviously the position that John has developed at great length. And I take it to be a serious and open question whether IBE or something like what John is doing is the right way to think about it. But there's only going to be one slide on that. Who are the externalists about scientific knowledge? Alexander Bird is one such externalist. Is he like the best? I don't know. I mean, he's certainly a great philosopher. He goes in a way that for some reason is like sweeping epistemology. This is the Williamson way, the knowledge first way. What does this exactly involve? A wide variety of considerations, but I guess the core assumption, if you haven't heard of it, is that there is no reductive analysis of knowledge. You can't. So it's knowledge first in the sense that you take it as a primitive, and you don't try to reduce it or analyze it into something else. I think actually that's something we should all kind of get on board on. But there's additional considerations that Williamson presents that he thinks follow from this, including that your evidence is identical to your knowledge. This is the thing that Bird assumes in his objections to inference the best explanation. So this is certainly a serious alternative program for thinking about scientific knowledge that I need to confront. My objection to it is that Bird presents a bunch of epistemic norms which tell you how you should reason. But because we can't tell what our evidence is, there's actually no way for us to follow these norms. So it's kind of, the harsh word would be inhuman. It's like God putting something on you and you have to follow it. You're obligated to follow it, but actually you can't. Like if you did, that's good for you, but there was nothing that you can do to follow it. This is the general concern that I would have. Is that enough to convince Bird that he's wrong? I doubt it. But to me, it really undermines the articulateness of the defense of realism that I was trying to go for before. Enumerative induction, I think I'll just say one or two words about this. If you think about the claims that you're sampling from the model, the predictions that you've checked, it's just not a very good enumerative induction to go from those claims to any sort of causal generalization or to go back to the theoretical claims that you used. Because they're just different sorts of claims, and there's no reason to take this sample and extrapolate it in that way. Okay. Here's my attempt on one slide to summarize John's two books, which are like 1,000 pages. For the first, 10 years of my life thinking about the material theory of induction, I thought it was just externalism. I thought it was just, if you reason in the right way in accordance with the facts, then you can know things. If you don't, then you can't. End of story. But in fact, I think John has a more elaborate and sophisticated story about how scientific knowledge can result even from those cases where we start with assumptions that we don't know. And for example, when I draw some conclusion from a sample, I have to assume as a hypothesis that, say, each crystalline substance has a single characteristic crystallographic form. But I don't have any evidence for that, and I don't know it. Or maybe I have some evidence, but I don't know it. And so the traditional epistemic problem is, yeah, but okay, how can you assume something that you don't know to go from the premise to the conclusion? say of a particular material inference. And you don't even believe it, maybe, you're just assuming it, like as a hypothesis. And so as I understand it, John's proposal is that's okay. And it's okay for those assumptions to kind of ramify throughout an extended period of scientific investigation. But if ultimately there's no problems, then there's a kind of self-supporting structure where then it can, all these like unknown things can become known, right? In virtue of this broader large-scale structures. I say it's better. Stay local. It's better for the scientists to take on their local claims to know and evaluate it in their local terms. And this, to me, is better reconstructed in terms of these local subject-specific inference to the best explanation. It's still not clear to me if there's any real disagreement. And there's obviously a terminological disagreement. There's obviously like a strategic disagreement in terms of saying who knows what when. But whether, say, the scope of scientific knowledge would be much greater on John's proposal or much less on my proposal, this I think is something I'd very much like to think more about. Okay, so last slide. Were your questions? Definitely. Feel good about this one. We can adapt the traditional defense of scientific realism using IBE to cases involving idealized models. I was happy with IBE to start. I was already a traditional limited scientific realist. People gave me these idealized models problems. I'm like, oh wait, no, it's not a problem. So this is the route that leads to the first column. Pretty much all the limited scientific realists ever wanted to say, you can still say on this recasting. Well, wait a second. There are obviously these people out there who are skeptical about IBE, this capacity to generate knowledge. Many of these people are not scientific realists, okay? But for the people who are scientific realists, who don't want to use IBE in this way, they need to give us their story. Bird's given us his story, John's given us his story. And now we have a certain kind of strategic choice. Which among these choices is the best one for the realist to pursue? And I'm obviously advocating for the IBE one. Great, thank you.
We take a 2-minute break and then we'll have plenty of time for questions.
Yeah.